So, Hyman, Dr. Hyman Schipper, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me again. We talked once before with our common friend Gary Goldberg, a neurologist, but unfortunately that very enjoyable conversation was not recorded, and we decided it would be good to come together again to explore something that was really an eye-opener to me, which was how much of the world that I was coming to see through a combination of the hemisphere theory and philosophy brought me to insights that were ancient within a tradition I knew almost nothing about, namely that of Judaic mysticism, the Kabbalah. You know an enormous amount about this, and I thought it would be very good for us to elaborate on the common points we find. So thank you for coming, and let's go. I know you've got some pictures you want to share with us, so please go, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed our last conversation back in February with you and with Gary, and I think this is a very fertile ground for discussion because there seems to me tremendous convergence of ideas, not so much the lexicon. Of course, the terms we use to describe what we are interested in may be radically different, but I'm interested in the concepts. And I think many of the concepts, there's a conflation of ideas between the Kabbalah and much of what you've written in several of your books. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Kabbalah, and then as we're discussing it, I will try to point out where I believe there are nodes of overlap. And I've chosen the title, which is the same title of a book that I published in 2021 called Kabbalistic Panpsychism, which already suggests that the entire universe has some sort of consciousness to it. Whether it's a molecule, whether it's a person, whether it's a rabbit, whether it's a planet, doesn't mean that, of course, the type of sentience in a human being and that of a grasshopper are equivalent. Of course not. But the Kabbalah does intimate that, and I'll tell you why that is in a moment, that there is consciousness pervading the entire cosmos, the entire creation. Just to introduce what the Kabbalah is, it derives from the Hebrew word Kabbalah, which comes from kibel, which means to receive. It is the esoteric aspect of the Torah that Moses received from God on Mount Sinai. He received the esoteric and the exoteric, which is familiar to you as the five books of Moses, the Mishnah, the Gemara, which together are called the Talmud, which is a term commonly used for the revealed Torah, which was passed on from Moses to the elders to others throughout time to basically the entire Jewish community. It was incumbent on everybody to have some proficiency throughout time with the revealed Torah. But at the same time, the secrets of the Torah, the word secret is sod, which means secret, was passed on very selectively to specific individuals who then mastered the material and passed it on to a very small subset of disciples. And this was kept more or less under the radar of general Torah scholarship, although there were periods where this esoteric knowledge sort of burst into the mainstream, at least transiently. For example, in the 2nd century, with the writings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, then in the 16th century, in the city of Safed in Israel, and then there was a tremendous convergence of the exoteric and esoteric Torah with the birth of Hasidism, and it is anticipated that as we approach what is referred to as the Messianic era, which is the 7th millennium, which is about 220 years from now, there's going to be an explosion of the esoteric aspects of the Torah into the mainstream. And I personally believe we're starting to see glimmers of this even today. And there's much more being written on the Kabbalah than there was before. And it's available in many bookstores. Whereas in the past, it was truly a hidden science, hidden from the world, hidden from most Jews, as well as everybody else, hidden. But now it's starting to appear. And what I find fascinating is that the very same sciences that throughout the last few millennia pulled Jews and Christians away from their faith with notions of Aristotelian permanence to the universe, no beginning, many concepts that sounded very appealing, and many Jews and Christians would reject their faith in favor of those secular concepts because they seem to disagree with the notion of a creation ex nihilo. But the very same sciences that were pulling people away from their faiths today, I think, are the greatest source of evidence for many of the truths that are encoded in the Bible. And that's something that I'll briefly go over as I go through these slides. Before even moving deeper into Kabbalah, it's important to understand how Judaism is viewed theologically. And here already is the first node of interaction with much of your writing, as you'll see in a moment. There are three basic views that you could suggest how the creator relates to the cosmos, to the creation. One is that God created a universe, but then lets the universe run along its own devices. And that would be standard theism. And if God completely leaves the picture, that would be deism. Another view, promulgated by the likes of Baruch Spinoza in the 1600s, is that if you understand every aspect of the creation, that is God. That is, that God is purely immanent within the creation, no transcendent qualities, and that's referred to as pantheism. And pantheism is really anathema to Jewish thinking. It really does not fit not just a Kabbalistic mystical view, but just standard Judaism. The true approach of the Kabbalah and Judaism, I believe, and Christianity to a large extent, I guess, depending on who you read, but is that of panentheism. And that's a term that comes up in your own writings, Iain, which suggests that God both has a transcendent quality, shown here, and is also completely immanent within every aspect of the creation. So it's almost like a combination of theism and pantheism. And this is a very vital concept that informs all aspects of the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. The basic principle underlying the Kabbalah is that everything, which means every object, but also every event, is made of or coded by what are called 10 sephirot. The sephirot can be defined as godly forces or energy, powers of the creator, attributes, or even information packets. And even though they appear to us as 10, they are in principle unified. So this is a bit of a paradox that, again, is addressed in your writings, that we have to be able to assimilate the notion, the paradoxical notion, that God is both infinite and indivisible, but at the same time has the power to manifest himself in a finite fashion. Because if he couldn't do it, he wouldn't really be infinite, would he? So the 10 sephirot is how we are able to understand how God runs the universe. But in reality, the 10 sephirot are really a unified wholeness. It's almost like suggesting that when you look at the deity or theology holistically, you're peering into David Bohm's deep into his implicate order. But when you're looking at the divisiveness of the cosmos, the fact that things are separate, I'm separate from you and you're separate from your desk, and then you are really touching on what David Bohm referred to as the explicate order. And it isn't that one is correct and one is not correct. They're both correct. But the human mind, especially the left hemisphere, has trouble holding on to paradoxical concepts. That's more of a right hemisphere type function. And that's the Kabbalah understands that, and I think so do you in many of the things that I've read of what you've written. So the light of God, we refer to each sephirah as consisting of light, but this is not physical light, this is spiritual light, and a vessel, which is also made of a cruder form of light, if you will, that holds its portion of light. So, for example, Gvura, which is strength or contraction, there's light coming from the Ein Sof. Ein Sof is the infinite, the unlimited God. We can't even really describe it in positive terms, only what he isn't, not what he is. He sends light into these sephirot, and the first of them is called Keter. Keter in Hebrew means crown, and it has properties very unlike all the other sephirot in that it is whatever system you're looking at, be it a person or a planet or an event, Keter is always outside your system, reaching in. What the first sephirah that's inside your system that you're looking at would be Chokhmah, which has the right hemisphere as a homologue. So the light from Keter, which is outside your system, pours into Chokhmah. Chokhmah then presents its light to Bina. Bina would be the left hemisphere. Bina then to Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and finally, the last of the sephirot, Malchut, which means kingship. What it does, it's a transducer. It converts the light that it receives into a product. The product can be an object. It could be a thought. It could be an event even. So this, in a way, is sort of similar to Whiteheadian process philosophy or theology, where things aren't described just as objects, but as more of events, which Whiteheadian philosophy refers to as occasions. And every occasion, every event, every object is made of these 10 sephirot. Now, it's important to understand that of these 10 sephirot, the top 3 are the consciousness of any system that you're considering, whether it's a human being, whether it's a chimpanzee, whether it's a water molecule. Everything is made of 10 sephirot, and the top 3 are its consciousness. Hence, the Kabbalah is panpsychist in its ontology. What's interesting, I think you do refer to this shattering of the vessels somewhere in your writing. I did come across it.
Indeed.
Yeah.
No, I do. I think the whole story is amazing. We must come back to it, but yes.
So that's referred to as, in Hebrew, shvirat hakelim, the breaking of or shattering of the vessels. And when God first created the second highest world, really, called Atzilut, he purposefully mismatched the light in the vessel so that there'd be a breakage, because there's a lot of benefit in fixing what was broken, because it allows human beings to play a role in this fixing, which is called tikkun olam, fixing the world, which is our responsibility as people. We need to partner with God to reform the shattered vessels, which is what we've been doing for the last several thousand years. And we're going to see a tremendous rectification, not complete, but compared to now, very advanced in the Messianic era, which I mentioned is like coming. It's like within the next 220 years. But what's important here in this slide is that only the 7 lower sephirot, the bodily sephirot, from Chesed down to Malchut, shattered. The top sephirot, the conscious ones, did not shatter. What that means is, this explains, I believe, why it is that every physical thing, every body is made up of innumerable parts. I'm made of, I have a spleen, I have a heart, I have a nervous system. But consciousness, since the original consciousness making up the 10 sephirot cosmos did not shatter, therefore there's only one consciousness to a customer. In other words, I have many parts physically representing the shattered 7 sephirot, but I only have one consciousness, me. And that unification of consciousness within every person, every object, every animal, every plant is because these conscious sephirot did not shatter, according to the Lurianic Kabbalah. This slide just makes the point of how Keter, which represents divine will, it's even primordial to thought, is will. And the Keter will give its light or influence down the hierarchy from Keter to Chochmah, Chochmah to Bina, as I said, down to Malchut. But importantly, there is a link between Keter, which is outside your system, represented by this wormhole here, which talks to Malchut, independently of the rest of the Sephirot, which forces Malchut, when it makes its product, be it an object or a thought or an event, to conform perfectly with the divine will. And these events down here, what Malchut produces as observers, and I'll get into this a little bit in the last slide or two, we look at these events that are around us as random. Science looks at them as random. Quantum physicists look at the collapse of the wave function as a random event. Could just as easily been one thing, or Schrodinger's cat could have been either alive or dead with equal probability, but not so says the Kabbalah. Kabbalah insists that although we understand 4 of the 5 major axes of reality, which is Chochmah Bina, which is the axis of time, and the 3 axes of space, Tiferet Yesod is one axis, Netzachod. These 4 axes are understood by science, but Keter Malchut, the relationship of the physical world to spirituality that's outside the physical system, hence the wormhole here, metaphorical wormhole, that is not yet understood by science, according to the Kabbalah. Now, after Keter, you reach the sephirot that are in the system that you're studying or perceiving. And the first one of them is Chochmah, which, Iain, you do talk about a great deal, and you talk about it very accurately from a Kabbalistic perspective. So Chochmah, if you look at it cosmologically, because everything that happens in the human being has a counterpart in the cosmos at large. That's called interinclusion or hitkalalut. I'll show you a diagram of that in a moment. In other words, the entire cosmos is sort of recapitulated in each of its parts, very Bohmian-like holographic universe. Kabbalah is very certain about this. So the Chochmah would represent cosmologically as the singularity. It's not nothing. Nothing would be sort of Keter. In fact, Keter is called Ayin, which means nothing because it's just not manifest. It's will. Chochmah is the first manifestation, which is a singularity. But note that a singularity, according to physics, it contains absolutely everything in it. It's just not differentiated. It's a point. A point, you can put a point on the graph, but a point has no dimensions. And here's where we'll get, in the course of our discussion, into areas where we may sort of see a little differently on certain areas, and we'll touch upon it, especially with regard to where time fits into this picture. Which last February we had a bit of a discussion about that, which I hope to revisit. So this is a cosmological singularity. And it's represented in human beings by the right hemisphere. This is Iain McGilchrist's master. It presents a gestalt. It shows you the big picture. In terms of thought processes, it's the eureka moment. All of a sudden, you get an idea, flash. It's not differentiated. You just know you got something. It's original. It has a transcendent quality, as Chokhmah does, because it's linked to Keter. Chokhmah's secondary only to Keter, which is the highest of the sephirot. It's paradox-friendly, as you mentioned the right hemisphere is. It more involves vision, because you can see around you, your environment in one eye gulp. You see the whole picture. Whereas when I'm expressing to you, I have to chop it into language, which is more differentiated, which is left hemisphere, as we'll talk in a moment. And I think Eastern philosophies spend much more emphasis on a sort of Chokhmah perspective or a right hemisphere perspective on reality, which of course is heavily discussed in your books. Bina, on the other hand, Chokhmah does give rise to Bina, which is interesting. Just thought that in your book you mentioned that the right hemisphere forms before the left hemisphere. Well, in Kabbalah, Chokhmah does precede Bina. Bina would be the aftermath of the Big Bang. It's where the singularity now bursts into time, space, matter, and energy. In other words, time only exists linearly once you reach Bina. In Chokhmah, there is time only as a potential. There really is no time, but in Keter, time is not, we don't even talk about time. So this is one little area where we sort of didn't see exactly eye to eye when we spoke in February, because this tells us, the Kabbalah suggests, that God is way out of time. He does not operate within time. And if I understood correctly what you wrote, you suggested that God operates within time, and time then to you would be fundamental, where it's not fundamental, neither is space, matter, energy, in the cosmogony of the Kabbalah. Okay.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, sure. Bina would be represented in the human being by the left hemisphere. It's your emissary. There, instead of a gestalt, there's now differentiation. It's language rather than a thought. It's more hearing than vision. It's intolerant of paradox. Things have to be black and white. There is no holding opposites. For example, we used to think that everything was an epistemic paradox. In other words, when we encountered paradoxes, we used to believe that it's only a paradox because we're not smart enough to resolve the paradox. But then came 20th century quantum mechanics and taught us something absolutely profound. And that is that light is both a wave, energy, but it's also a particle, a photon. Well, which one really is it? It's both. And it requires a right hemisphere to be able to accept that kind of paradox. But I think that paradox opened up the Kabbalah, which was very opaque in the past, to more contemporary analysis, because science has taught us to become more comfortable with not just epistemic paradox, but ontic paradox. And I think that's a vitally important idea. I mentioned that in the Kabbalah, the entire cosmos is recapitulated in each of its parts. And that's in English called inter-inclusion, hitkalalut in Hebrew, and it's represented here in this diagram. So if you look at any sephirah, let's say Chokhmah, and you look into it, let's say with a microscope, metaphorical microscope, what you see there are 10 sephirot. And if you look at each of those mini sephirot, there are 10 mini sephirot, and it goes on almost ad infinitum. And that is the idea of a hologram. Except holography came to us with Dennis Gabor in the middle of the 20th century, and the Kabbalah has been talking about hitkalalut or inter-inclusion for millennia. Hologram has a very important manifestation that I'll go over in this slide, if you take a regular photographic plate, let's say of the globe, a regular picture, and you cut out the right upper portion of the globe, what you might see in that little piece is, in this analogy, Siberia, perhaps. But if you were to take a holographic plate and cut out of a globe and cut out this small right upper segment and shine a laser through it, you don't just see Siberia, you see the entire globe. Because the entire reality is recapitulated in every photon of that holographic image. It's mind-boggling, but it's important. And it's important, certainly was very important to David Bohm, whose physics was heavily built around a scaffolding of a holographic universe. And strangely enough, David Bohm's work is becoming more popular since he passed away than in his lifetime, with people like Jacob Bekenstein analyzing the surface of black holes or the event horizon of black holes and showing that indeed the entire cosmos may be built according to a holographic design, which is absolutely remarkable. Another feature, which is vital in understanding how the Kabbalah construes the underlying unity of reality, is the notion of hitkashrut, which is interpenetration in English. Here are three worlds. There are 5 worlds. We'll talk about the bottom 3 for a moment: Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. All of physical reality only pops out from Malchut at the bottom of Asiya. All these other worlds are all spiritual entities that the Kabbalah deals with. Each one has its own properties, but they're not important for us to discuss here. But what I do want to mention is I showed you how the light of the Ein Sof, the infinite, penetrates through Keter of, let's say, the world of Bria, goes down the hierarchy all the way to Malchut. Then Malchut of the higher world Bria becomes or feeds into the Keter of the next lower world, Yetzira. So what's very mundane in Bria is highly spiritual in Yetzira. And then the influence, the divine influence, flows down Yetzira, and from Malchut of Yetzira, it goes into Keter of Asiya, and finally it goes to Malchut, and you get a product. This is the standard flow of divine influence in the cosmos, in the creation. But at the very same time, the creator can activate or actualize one sephirot, let's call it chesed, loving kindness, shown here in gray, concomitantly throughout every nook and cranny of the cosmos. So if he decides to pour loving kindness into the creation, everything starts to glow with loving kindness. We don't necessarily see it because this would be Bohm's implicate order, but this is what the idea of hitkashrut indicates. And it's a much higher cohesiveness of the cosmos, because then you can boil everything down, all creation, into 10 things, the 10 sephirot. One is chokhmah, one is bina, and they all interconnect, even though we don't see that in our world of Asiya, because we are looking at the highly divided explicate order, to use Bohmian terms. Now, this sounds very mystical, but it has a scientific correlate. In fact, the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022 was given for this concept, quantum entanglement. It's really no different. What quantum entanglement is telling us, if you have a progenitor particle and it splits into 2 particles, let's call it 2 photons. Here, photon 1 and photon 2. Photons have a property called spin, and spin can be either up or down. If photon 1 is spin up, then photon 2 has to be spin down by the laws of quantum mechanics. If these 2 particles, photon 1 and 2, travel to opposite ends of the universe, and if you can manipulate photon 1 to make it from spin up to spin down, photon 2 automatically goes from spin down to spin up, even if it's at the other end of the universe. This isn't science fiction. This has been proven by, Bell, for example. Bell's inequality disproved Einstein's view that this is impossible. Einstein couldn't accept this. Why? because this would suggest that information traveling from photon A to B across the universe is traveling at a superluminal speed. That's impossible according to the laws of relativity. But Einstein was misinterpreting this picture. Quantum mechanics understands this differently. It understands it as more like the way David Bohm would understand it, that photon 1 and 2 are separate photons only in the explicate order. But because they originated from a progenitor particle, if you can look in the implicate order, you'd see that photon 1 and 2 are really the same thing, which in the explicate order looks like separation. This is the idea of interpenetration. This is a slide that I really enjoy discussing, especially with physicists. And there is within the sphere of Keter a structure that is ancient. It's even mentioned in the Zohar, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, depending on when you think the Zohar was published. And it's called the Radla in Aramaic, Reisha de lo Isyada, the unknowable head. That's how it's translated. Not the unknown head, the unknowable head. You can't know what's happening inside this Radla. And it has some remarkable parallelisms to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Let me give you an example of this. God wills something to happen. Let's call that something ABCD. What the Radla does is it scrambles God's message, ABCD, into every possible permutation combination of ABCD, ABCD, CABD, DCBA, and it transmits all these potential, all these possibilities down through the sephirot until it reaches the transducer, the last malchut. And when you observe something, you observe an object. And that object that you see happens to be ABCD. Now, this is very similar to the idea of a superposition of states, according to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. And when you observe something, you collapse the wave function and you get an object, let's say, that you see in front of you. Either Schrodinger's cat is alive or it's dead. And it's ABCD. Now, the physicists will tell you that it could just as easily have been DCBA, CABD. It's a random event. Here's where the Kabbalah and science differ radically. Because of this Keter-Malchut connection that I mentioned in an earlier slide, when you observe something and it's ABCD, it could only have been ABCD. Could not have been the other possibilities. Because Keter imposes God's will on reality. Now, this sets up an incredible paradox. And the paradox is as follows. We live and operate below this Radla membrane, inside, below it, let's say. As such, we see randomness. The quantum physicist sees randomness. We cannot intuit the will of God. If we could, we would see that what happened today could only have happened. Nothing else could have happened, even though there were other possibilities. There have been individuals throughout history who have been able to pierce this Radla barrier to directly intuit the will of God, and they're called prophets. That's what prophecy is, the ability to pierce this membrane, and therefore see what will happen, that it will only be ABCD. But this comes at a price, because the reason we operate below this Radla membrane is to give us some semblance of non-determinism. When the prophet, like Balaam the prophet in the Old Testament is a great example of this, he told the king Balak, he said, look, I'll curse the Jews for you, no problem. But as soon as I get prophecy, I can only say what God puts into my mouth. This is this concept that I'm trying to illustrate here. And most people are not prophets, and therefore it seems like Schrodinger's cat could just as easily have been alive or dead. So these were some of the sort of factual Kabbalistic slides I wanted to share with you. If I have another minute or two, I just want to say that that Kabbalistic Panpsychism completely does away with Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. We don't have to ask how material existence generates consciousness, because consciousness is there from the get-go. The mind of God, absolute consciousness, is there even before there's matter. The three conscious sephirot precede the bodily sephirot. Also, it neutralizes a very important threat, if you will, or to panpsychism, which is the combination problem. How do small little consciousness, let's say in a paramecium or in a water molecule, how do those mini consciousness combine to give you the splendid consciousness of a human being? How could that possibly happen? That point is moot according to the Kabbalah, because you're starting with infinite consciousness, which is being packaged through each keter of each 10 sephirot system into the kind of consciousness that you need to keep a rock in existence, to keep a plant growing, to keep an animal with emotions, and to give rational behavior to a human being. There is no combination problem. So it takes care, the Kabbalah easily renders this problem moot. And of course, because Keter is outside whatever system you're talking about, and our ability of Chokhmah to interact with Keter, this would suggest that there may be non-local properties of human consciousness entangled with transcendent aspects of godliness or divinity. And this may account for prophecy, as I already mentioned, but also maybe ESP, near-death experiences, and other so-called paranormal phenomena that have been documented everywhere. So, and this is a lot of these concepts I explore in much more detail in this book, including some speculation on what the future of human consciousness will look like. So I do have other slides which I would have kept just in case they can help me answer a question that you may have, but maybe I'll end the show here.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure that almost everybody watching it will have learnt something from it. And I do recommend your book. It was extremely revealing for me. I'm trying to think if there are important points that we would differ on. I suppose one of the things is that I'm not Jewish. I was not brought up in that tradition. So I found myself coming to the insights of the Kabbalah, if you like, spontaneously or intuitively. They seem to me to be right, even though I'd never heard them and nobody had ever talked about them or tried to explain them to me. So that, of course, immediately sets up a sense of there's something real here that's very important, because it's not just something worked out by a lot of scholars and turned into a complicated system. Although I do have to say, I think there's an element of that. I think that insights can be over-systematized, but that's another matter. But I mean, in general, the insights of this are extraordinarily important to me. I think the concept of panentheism, which you talked about at an early stage, is important, but it's there in a number of traditions. I was very pleased to see that it is there in Judaism. It seems to me to be essential in Christianity as well. Indeed, the doctrine of the Trinity is one way of talking about panentheism, that it is both the mind of God, it is both what God brought forth, and it is what then happens in creation because of God having brought that forth. So all of those three things are part of one, and yet we would conventionally carve them up. And you know what you emphasized was a lot of things to do. I mean, I was astonished when I first read about Chokhmah and Bina and the right and the left, and they just were so like the right hemisphere's capacities and those of the left. There were one or two tweaks I'd make. I mean, for example, about sight and hearing. I mean, that may be a broad principle, but for example, music is very much best understood really by the right hemisphere. So I don't think one's meant to take those as very simple. I think one's meant to take them in a way that I'm sure you could have elaborated if you'd had time. But generally speaking, the insight that there were these two faculties that needed one another. Somebody calls them like a brother and sister that need one another and can't be properly separated. That was a huge insight. And I think what is reflected in some of what you've said just now is the problem that happens when the left hemisphere conceives everything bottom up from the fragments that it has made out of what the right hemisphere has seen as whole. And so you get these illusory problems. How can we get consciousness out of matter? I mean, I say it's a hard problem only because it's been set up in that way. If you set it up like that, you've really got a problem and you're never going to solve it. Because matter and consciousness are never so alien that matter is not something that has consciousness in it or is in consciousness. In fact, I myself believe that matter and consciousness are different phases of the same thing. So that one is, as it were, invisible and all the rest. The other is visible, concrete, offers resistance, offers a degree of persistence for a while. When I have a thought in my consciousness, it goes. I mean, I can summon it back because of memory, but it's not there. But, you know, the table in front of me will be there tomorrow morning, and there's a degree of permanence through the material, as well as a degree of resistance offered by the realm of the material. And I see that resistance as terrifically important for creation, because I think there's an element, I don't know if, I thought I'd seen it in the Kabbalah, but I don't notice you say much about it, that negativity is part of the creative process. But it is, very importantly, isn't it?
It's you know, absolutely vital. Absolutely vital.
That's what wonderful to hear, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that in a minute. But it brings me to the story of creation in the Lurianic Kabbalah, which when I first heard it completely blew me away, as they say. The idea there, as you know, and you referred to parts of the story, is that Ein Sof, the primary infinite being, desired something, some creation, something other than itself. And what was its first act? To stretch out a hand and make something? No, it was to limit itself. This seems to be completely wonderful. To withdraw, tzimtzum, this phase of making a space in which something other than the divine can be. And then the second phase was, I won't pronounce this correctly, but sephirot hakelim, the shattering of the vessels, which you alluded to. And it was nice that you made clear that out of these 10 vessels, 7 were shattered, but 3 were not actually. But the idea in there, as I understand it, is that these vessels were not capable of containing this single spark that came out of Ein Sof and landed on the vessels. And so they were shattered. But they can be remade better than they were. This is a really good bit, isn't it? And this is the role of human beings in their lives, is that they have the power to not single-handedly, of course, but to take part in this process of remaking, rebuilding, repairing those vessels, tikkun. And when I think of that, I think of this Japanese ceramic art called kintsugi, in which a broken vessel is often repaired with little lines of gilt. And when it's put together again, it's more beautiful than the vessel was before it was broken. So there's something very deep in that image for me. Yeah, I think more or less we do agree on all those things. I mean, the time issue is a difficult one for me. I suppose what I would say is that, and I could be accused of having my cake and eating it, but I think that when it comes to God, one has to be rather overconfident, to rule out any possibilities. And one of the things about God, as you say, that we can only say by the apophatic route, by the via negativa, by the things we can say, it is not the case rather than what is the case. But one of the things that I've emphasized is this Whiteheadian idea of the divine being, the ground of being, and the cosmos coming into being and coming to know one another more and more fully, eternally, so that they sort of bring one another together into being. But I think also it's reasonable to say that is the God that is immanent in the creation, but there is also the God that is transcendent of the creation, and that God is eternal and unchanging. Mm-hmm. So it is possible for God to be both eternal outside of time and unchanging, but also inside time and creating in that realm inside time, which is the only one that we can know.
Yeah. Well, I agree very much with this formulation that you just mentioned regarding the transcendent qualities and the immanent qualities of God. And it is correct that God intentionally shattered vessels so that he can create a human being to help repair this tikkun olam. The purpose, though, is not for God to gain anything from a Kabbalistic point of view. God does not benefit from our tikkun olam. It's a phenomenal gift to mankind to be able to act in a godly fashion, doing unlimited good, mitzvot, as they're called, the commandments, of which there are 613. And the reason he created man is to be able for us to benefit from his goodness. He does not, and here's where we sort of didn't exactly see eye to eye, and you were quoting somebody by the name of Sanford Drob in your book.
Yes.
He was saying also, which I'm not sure I agree with, the notion that God doesn't really know what is he knows all the potentialities, but what actually emerges, he's on a learning curve also. That is not at all a Kabbalistic understanding, because omniscience is absolute, just like God is absolute, his unity is absolute, his knowledge is absolute. But it only looks like in this, so where his abode, God's place, there is no time, because time is a creation, and God always transcends. He has a transcendent quality to transcend his creation. And if time's a creation, he transcends time and space. But we are underneath this sort of radla, as I mentioned. And for us, time is linearized so that there is a past, present, and future. It would be silly for us to, for example, recognize that we may live in what Einstein called a block universe, where there really is no flow of time, which the Kabbalah agrees with. But based on that, am I not going to try to learn from my mistakes or plan my next vacation? Of course I will.
Yes.
Because I'm operating in this linearized world. Even though at the same time, all I'm going to plan is already, there's foreknowledge in God's mind as to everything that I'm going to do. So does free will, in other words, does free will exist? Depends on your perspective. From God's point of view, really there isn't. And many rabbis have spoken up on this, Hasidic rabbis. Whereas from our point of view, we have free will, and we should be punished if we go astray.
Yes.
That's complicated.
I find that part harder to share.
I understand.
Because of a number of things. I suppose a very simple one, and probably quite simple to answer, is if God doesn't operate in time, then what happened at the moment when God created by the process of Tzimtzum and so forth? what was before that, and why did he need to step into time to do this? You could say, well, he didn't step into time, but then we start to fail to understand, because once you take time out of a description of anything, it is impossible for the human mind to comprehend it, because everything collapses into a unity at that point. I'd also say a number of things, really. One is that I don't see God as only somehow creating something for our good, because it seems to me that God is, if anything, is relational. And in many traditions, what that relation is love. In Christianity, God is fundamentally love. In Buddhism, God is, whatever one means by God in Buddhism, it is fundamentally love. But it is a relation. And for that to happen, there has to be a degree of unknowing or freedom in the relation. Otherwise, it's simply a matter of control. It's a matter of a sort of engineering God, tinkering with things, an idea I find rather left hemispheric and dislike. So I'm very much a believer that there is a degree of freedom, and that the alternatives are not randomness or perfect order, but in fact an order that comes into being and is no way random. So that, for example, it's perfectly compatible for things not to be determined and yet neither to be random. So much of biology is like this. There are certain processes that are not actually in any obvious way specifically determined, but they're not random at all. And the outcomes can be broadly, if not in particular cases, can be broadly predicted. And so you have this capacity for freedom with constraint, for directionality in creation, for relationality, a two-way relationality in creation, which it seems to me that God can be generous enough to accept from the love of his creatures as much as those creatures need to accept the love of God.
Yes, I did read of that perspective in your writings, and it's a subtlety that I think is somewhat parallel to what I was trying to say about free will, whether we really have it or not. And I concluded in the slide that even though God knows what we're going to do, he put us in a explicate order, to borrow Bohm, in a world where we feel that we are exercising our free will in every meaningful definition of the concept of free will. And the idea that, well, it's not really free will because God is running the show, he's the puppeteer, that's where the subtlety is. And this is the paradox that the Kabbalah tries to explain. It's not simple, that both realities are equal. It's not that one reality, the deeper one, God's reality, undermines our belief in free will. God actually gave us full free will in this world. This is almost like a strain of compatibilism in a way, where theological determination can be coextant with the notion of free agency. So that's how. So regarding the issue of love, I will give this a lot more thought now that you raised the reciprocity aspect of it. But according to my understanding, the sources that I frequent, that I read, the main purpose of the creation was for to be able to bestow on us, so we are beneficiaries. In other words, God really doesn't, from a purely Kabbalistic perspective, God doesn't require us. He does not require us. I don't want to say he doesn't require our love, because it doesn't sound like what most people define love as, the reciprocity. But from my understanding, he doesn't require any aspect of his creation. But he created so that we can benefit from the goodness that he can bestow. And why did he want us to benefit from the goodness? That's a question we don't ask, because that's in Keter. We don't ask questions. We're told not to ask questions that relate to the sphere of Keter, because Keter is the will of God. And as I mentioned several times, it's outside our purview. It's outside our system of thinking. And that's where some element of faith has to play a role. In our tradition, no matter how brilliant a rabbi could be, he will reach a point where his bina and his chokhmah will stop, because we're human beings, finite creatures. And at that point, the rest remains in Hebrew emunah, which is faith.
Yes.
And so that's the best I could do to try to address this conundrum of the loves of the reciprocity of love.
Well, I mean, I don't wish to suggest that this is a sort of an argument or that something can be resolved in it, because when one comes to the matter of faith at the end of the day, one is talking about a deep sense, an intuition that comes from experience that there is such a God, and so we all will have to make up our own minds about that. I try to suggest in that chapter, The Sense of the Sacred, at the end of The Matter with Things, that God, it sounds perhaps a bit casuistical, but that it would be a failure in God if he was not able to experience infallibility, not to experience a degree of fallibility which is compatible with his being infallible. In other words, the fallibility can be wrapped up into his infallibility, just as his not knowing can be wrapped up into omniscience. And I make a distinction between the omniscience, which is the omniscience of the left hemisphere, in which all the facts, as it were, are known. And really the difference here is the idea that the facts would be known ahead of time. But there's a different kind of knowing, which is a much deeper kind of knowing, which is the knowing, as I say, of potential and the knowing of experience. And it hasn't yet been crystallized into the factual knowing of the left hemisphere, but is still a knowing that God knows inside out from acquaintance, and the knowing that God knows the potential of, but doesn't know how it's actually going to fall out. So there is this degree of freedom in it. I don't feel that that's a weakness in the idea, or a sense of a falling away in the idea of God's greatness. It seems to me it might be a part of his greatness.
Well,
we probably will disagree about that, but yeah.
But we did allude to the fact that for God to be truly omniscient and omnipotent, he has to be able to limit himself as well. This is a general way of relating to what you just said. Otherwise, the idea of him or her, both, because there's male and female aspects of the divinity according to the Kabbalah. In order to undergo the tzimtzum, he had to contract his light. He had to impose finiteness. Limit.
Exactly.
And that's how he created the universe, as you correctly alluded to. You don't say in the first sentence of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elokim, God, in the beginning God created. There are two ways the word God could have been used. They could have used Elokim, which is what's used, or it could have used the tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He. But the Yud Kei Vav Kei is the chesed aspect of God, the flowing, the loving kindness aspect. Elohim, which is what is actually written, is the stern hand of Gvura of God. When God punishes, it's the name Elohim that's doing the work. When he bestows love, it's the tetragrammaton. So in order to create the world, is Breshit bara Elohim. It's the contracting aspect that made the world. And in my book, I give an analogy, a simple one, why that had to be. Because he had to withdraw his light in order for there to be individuation. In other words, picture a room that has furniture, very nice furniture, and God visits the room, and his light bulb is blazing at 1 trillion watts. You're not going to see anything in the room. He has to lower the wattage, and eventually he withdraws enough wattage. So now, there's a table, there's a chair, and there's a mirror. That's the way God sort of, my understanding of the Tzimtzum, it is the act of Gvura. It's not the act of, it's the act of.
That's very good, and I like that, and I'd certainly resonate with that. I think it's implied, isn't it, in the words, at least in the English translation of the first few verses of the first chapter of Genesis, that each act of creation was a division. So the night was divided from the day, and the dry land from the sea, and so on and so forth. I like very much this idea, which I find present in many places in wisdom around the world, and is expressed well by Goethe, that the whole of creation is constantly in a reciprocity, which he describes as rather like the process of breathing, inhalation, exhalation, or the beating of the heart, in which there's the systole and then the diastole of the heart. That nature works by constantly uniting what is divided and dividing what is united. And so things are constantly coming together and moving apart. And it is in this process, which you actually see in the cells, the gametes, you see the chromosomes doing this dance in which they come together and separate and come together and separate. And this process is the generative process in all things. So some element of division, some element of union is there, but the really important thing is that division and union must at another level be unified, not kept separate. So ultimately union trumps division, but it needs that division in it. And the implicate and explicate order I see as this implicate order in which things are, as it were, potential and differentiated, and then they're made explicit, and there you see what they are. So it's rather like the flower unfolding, the bud unfolding, and the flower spreads out. But in no way has the bud been destroyed or negated. It's been fulfilled in the process of unfolding.
Yeah, well, this concept is. Go ahead.
Just a second, and then I'll hand back to you. This idea is very deep in Christian mystical theology. Nicholas Accusa talks about a process which he calls implicatio, explicatio, and then complicatio, which doesn't mean complication, but means embrace. So one is infolding, outfolding, and then together folding. And that process seems to be what the creative impulse of the universe is about. And just to touch on one thing before I finish, this explains the problem of starting from division, starting from the idea of divided pieces, which we find in mainstream reductionist science. How you mentioned the problem of how are all these little consciousnesses going to be put back together again? But they never were separate. How are the bits going to be put together? They never were, except a whole. They were just a highly differentiated whole. And in that differentiation, there was not ultimate division in that separative way, but there was just distinction, which then enriches the wholeness.
Yeah,
sorry, carry on.
Oh, it's absolutely correct. And it's important to understand that the individuation, the divisiveness that we see around us, and the holism are coextant. It's not like our minds, because we do have a strong left hemisphere, we, at best, we can toggle a little bit between divisiveness, holism. Maybe meditation helps get you more into the holistic groove. But they're both coexistent. It's not like sometimes in this slide I showed you with interpenetration. It's not like sometimes God runs the world in a hierarchical form, a ladder-like cause and effect form, and sometimes he deeply unites the elements into an implicit list. They're both. We have to get used to the idea that they're both there at the same time. They're both coextant, just like light is a particle and a wave, but it depends on how you want to examine it. You look at it this way, it's wave-like. You look at it this another way, it's particulate. But in reality, they're both there to send the absolute unity, the hollow movement of David Bohm, or the Ein Sof in Kabbalah, and all of the endless fragments are there at the same time. It's not like there's and this idea of breathing, that things go in and out. All of reality seems to behave according to that pattern, which in Hebrew is called ratza v'shov, which is flow, ratza, and shov, ebb. It's like flow and ebb and flow. Everything is, in fact, the most primary thing one can see in physics is a sine wave. Energy is a sine wave. Isn't a sine wave something that's constantly oscillating? Oscillation is, I think, very fundamental in the way God runs this place.
And what's wonderful is that I have this idea that things progress in a spiral shape. There's this idea that things come back to where they started from. Famous line of T.S. Eliot, we come back to the place where we started from and know it for the first time. Of course, you never can come back to that place, but you come back to some place on a spiral a little above it. Now, the thing about a spiral is, if you look at it from the side, it's a sine wave. If you look at it down its length, it's a single, perfect, unchanging circle.
Wow,
it's Isn't that good? I love it. And
I'll try to if I add it to my next book, I'm going to cite that. Maybe that's a very beautiful analogy.
It means a lot to me, but the idea that the division and union both play their parts and both are necessary, but in the end union triumphs, is in this story, which I don't know if you ever heard. Maybe it's an old one. I think, in fact, it does come from one of the traditional scriptures, but I can't remember which. But I heard it anyway from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And he told the story of a devout man who was reading in the Torah, or maybe in another Judaic text, and found that a famous rabbi had said that a certain thing was absolutely true. And then he read further and found that another equally famous rabbi said exactly the opposite and said that it wasn't true. And he was very perplexed by this, and he prayed to God. And God said, they're both right. And the man, feeling even more irritated than before, said, but they can't both be right. To which God replied, all three of you are right.
Yeah.
It's perfect, isn't it?
Yes, pretty much captures it. Wonderful.
Other things we haven't talked about, or it's quite a good point probably to end at, but if there's anything we haven't touched on, I'm happy to motor on, as it were.
I think we, in our discussion, we saw that the vast majority of concepts that are in your books do dovetail very nicely with ancient Kabbalistic ideas. There are some exceptions, which we briefly alluded to, how time plays into the picture, how love plays into the picture, maybe even free will to some extent, and the definition of true omniscience. There were some differences, but the fact, to me, what amazes me, the fact that you intuited so much overlap with the Kabbalah, which is considered a very esoteric body of knowledge, without actually being led into a certain path of understanding the Kabbalah, because I'm only giving you my best perception of what the Kabbalah is teaching. There are, I have colleagues and I have friends and some that see things somewhat differently, because they say there are 70 faces to the Torah. Every word can have 70 different definitions, not just those two rabbis who are both right. There could be 70 that are all right. And I think one of the beauties of the Kabbalah and what you've written is that we have to become much more flexible, more right hemispheric, to try to solve a lot of the problems that are in current society. I love the sciences. I'm a scientist myself. But the way it has gone the last 150 years, it emasculated the body of knowledge by removing any semblance of a soul from the science. And you've also written about it. We have tremendous intellect, and we have ability to assimilate tremendous amounts of very difficult science today, and we have curiosity, because the left hemisphere is curious. But where is the awe? Where is the wonder? This is where I think science is falling somewhat short. And I think, to me, the Kabbalah, what it does for me personally is I can look at a blade of grass and be like, oh my goodness, a blade of grass. How unbelievable. And that kind of awe is what this does for me personally.
Yes. The great Rabbi Abraham Heschel of the last century said that there are times when mankind might have desired power and have suffered for having too little power, but now what we lack is awe, and it is from the lack of awe that we will destroy ourselves.
Yeah, well, it's the same idea. Yeah, that's it.
I'm with him there. I'm with him. Yeah. Look, thank you very, very much for agreeing to talk to me about this area and exchanging our ideas. I think it's been lovely. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have this conversation again with you. Thank you.